The lake had always been more than just water to me. It was where I cast my first fishing line as a child, where I learned the patience that came with waiting for a bite, and where I found quiet in a world that rarely allowed it. Nestled behind rows of neatly trimmed lawns and identical houses, it looked like the crown jewel of the neighborhood, a shared escape that everyone seemed to enjoy but few truly appreciated. When I moved into the subdivision, I thought I was stepping into a community built on respect. Families gathered on porches, children played in yards, and the homeowners association boasted of shared amenities and natural beauty. It sounded like a dream. But I quickly learned that dreams in HOA-controlled neighborhoods often came with fine print and fines that followed. On a warm Saturday morning, I grabbed my fishing rod, a small tackle box, and a folding chair, and I walked to the lake. The sun glimmered on the surface, and the air was thick with the hum of summer. I picked a quiet spot near the reeds, set my chair down, and cast my line. The moment the lure hit the water, I felt the stress of the week melt away. But peace never lasts long when an HOA decides it has control over every detail of life. 2 board members approached, clipboards in hand, their expressions sharp with authority. They didn't greet me, didn't ask how I was doing. Instead, one of them scribbled something on a sheet, tore it off, and handed it to me like a judge delivering a sentence. It was a fine $600. The paper said I had violated the HOA's lake access policy. According to them, fishing was prohibited without prior written approval, which had never been mentioned when I bought the house. They claimed it was to protect the environment, but the smug way they handed me the ticket told a different story. This wasn't about the lake, it was about power. I argued at first, pointing out that the lake was supposed to be for all residents. Their response was simple and cold. Rules are rules. Pay the fine. $600 for sitting by the water and casting a line. I folded the paper, tucked it into my pocket, and packed up my things. But as I walked home, a storm brewed inside me. I thought of the hours I had worked to afford this place, the promises made about community and amenities, and the way I had just been treated like an intruder in my own neighborhood. Later that evening, I received a letter slipped under my door. It was from the HOA, formal and threatening. If I didn't pay the fine within 30 days, they would escalate the matter, add late fees, and even pursue legal action. The arrogance of it was almost laughable. But what broke me wasn't the letter. It was what happened the following week. Determined not to be bullied, I returned to the lake the next Saturday. This time, I barely had time to cast before I heard the sound of sirens. Within minutes, 2 police cars rolled up, lights flashing, tires crunching against the gravel path. The HOA had called 911, overfishing. Neighbors gathered, whispering, as I stood by the water, bewildered. The officers approached, clearly annoyed that their time was being wasted. They checked my ID, asked a few questions, and quickly realized the absurdity of the situation. Still, the humiliation lingered. I had been treated like a criminal for sitting by a lake that was advertised as part of the neighborhood I paid to live in. When the officers finally left, shaking their heads, the board members smirked as though they had won. To them, it was another display of control, another chance to flex authority. But what they didn't know was that they had lit a fire I couldn't put out. That night, I sat at my desk and began researching. I dug into property maps, county records, and the fine print of my mortgage documents. And what I discovered shifted everything. The HOA controlled the neighborhood, yes, but the lake itself was owned by the county, designated for potential private lease or purchase should any individual or organization step forward. They had power over residents, but not over the water. The next morning, I contacted the county office. I asked questions, gathered details, and confirmed what I already suspected. The HOA had no authority over fishing rights or usage. The only thing keeping me from the lake was their bluff and The fact that no one had ever thought to challenge them. That realization sparked a plan. The HOA wanted to humiliate me. They wanted me to pay fines, to bow my head, to accept their version of control. But I wasn't going to pay them a cent. Instead, I would do something no one in that neighborhood had ever imagined. I was going to buy the lake. And when I did, the board that fined me for fishing would find themselves staring at water they could no longer touch. The fine sat crumpled in the corner of my desk, a reminder of the arrogance I had endured. Every time I glanced at it, the anger rose again. But this time, I wasn't going to let that anger fester. I was going to use it. I started my research. Late into the night, the glow of the computer screen casting long shadows across the room. County records aren't glamorous, but they reveal truths hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy. I searched property maps, tax ledgers, zoning documents, anything that mentioned the lake. Hours blurred into the early morning until I found what I was looking for. The Homeowners Association didn't own the lake. It wasn't theirs to control, despite their smug enforcement and ridiculous fines. The water and the land immediately surrounding it technically belonged to the county. But there was a note buried in the records, available for private lease or purchase upon county approval. My heart pounded. The HOA had been bluffing. For years, they had enforced rules as though they were lords of the water, but legally their power stopped at the property lines. The lake was there for the taking if someone had the foresight and the courage to seize it. I printed the documents, highlighted key passages, and built a folder I carried like a weapon. For days, I studied every angle, every requirement for purchase. The county wasn't looking for just anyone to take over the lake. They wanted someone who could demonstrate, a plan for maintaining it, for ensuring it wasn't left to rot or misused. That was fine by me. I had spent my life outdoors, knew fishing regulations better than most, and had the means to make a strong case. Meanwhile, the HOA didn't let up. Another letter arrived, thicker than the first. This one was written in sterner language, citing continued disregard for community policy. They demanded I pay the $600 fine plus late fees. They threatened to add the balance to my homeowner's dues and, if unpaid, to place a lien on my property. It would have scared most people. That was their tactic, intimidation. But now I had knowledge, and knowledge is the one weapon arrogance can't stand against. Instead of writing a check, I drove to the county office. The building was dull and gray, but to me it looked like the doorway to freedom. I requested a meeting with the land management officer, and within the hour, I was sitting across from a woman who knew the files better than anyone. I laid out my case. I showed her the letters, explained the harassment, and highlighted the property records. I asked the one question that mattered. What would it take for me to purchase the lake? She leaned back in her chair, scanning the documents, and then nodded slowly. It's possible, she said. The HOA doesn't own this water. If you submit a purchase application with a reasonable stewardship plan, the county will review it. My chest tightened with anticipation. It wasn't guaranteed, but it was real. Over the next weeks, I poured myself into the project. I drafted plans for lake maintenance, outlined a modest budget for upkeep, and even included proposals for improving the shoreline. I framed it not as a personal victory, but as a civic improvement. The county wanted responsibility, not vengeance, and I gave them exactly what they were looking for. Meanwhile, the HOA kept pressing. Board members cornered me on walks asking about the unpaid fines. One even waved a clipboard in my face, reminding me of consequences. I smiled politely, offered no answers, and walked away. Each encounter fueled me. They had no idea what was coming. Finally, the day came. I submitted my application to purchase the lake, a thick packet of plans, forms, and supporting documents. The woman at the counter stamped it with a date, and I felt the weight of years of HOA arrogance begin to shift. Weeks passed. The HOA grew more aggressive, They mailed threats, they emailed warnings, and they even called my house to discuss resolution. I ignored them all. I knew what they didn't. The clock was ticking, but not for me. For them. One crisp morning, an envelope arrived from the county. My hands trembled as I tore it open. The letter inside was simple, almost clinical. Your application has been approved. Pending final transfer of funds, ownership of the property described will be recorded in your name. I stared at the words, stunned. The lake was mine. The same board that had slapped me with a $600 fine, that had called 911 to humiliate me in front of neighbors, now lived in a neighborhood where their prized lake belonged to the man they tried to crush. But I wasn't done. Owning the lake was only the beginning. The real satisfaction would come when they realized what that ownership meant, when they saw the signs go up, when the rules they once lorded over others were replaced by my own. The HOA wanted to play power games. They had no idea how badly they had just lost. The day I signed the transfer documents, the county office felt less like a government building and more like the battlefield where a war quietly ended. The papers were plain, filled with legal jargon and parcel numbers, but to me, they might as well have been a declaration of independence. When I scrawled my signature across the final page, the lake, every drop of water, every stretch of shoreline, was officially mine. I walked out with the deed in a folder under my arm. To anyone passing by, I looked like a man who had run errands at City Hall, but inside, I carried the weight of victory. The HOA had fined me $600 for fishing, and now I owned the very water they had tried to control. The first thing I did was drive straight to the lake. The autumn sun shimmered across its surface, and the breeze rippled through the reeds. For a moment, I just stood there, letting it sink in. This place, the same one where I had been humiliated and treated like an intruder, now belonged to me. But ownership isn't just about possession, it's about power. And I knew exactly how to wield it. That evening, I posted official notices around the lake. Private property. Trespassing strictly prohibited without owner consent. The bold black letters stood out against the white boards, and I nailed them into place with deliberate force. Anyone who wandered down to fish, swim, or picnic would see the signs before their feet touched the shoreline. Neighbors noticed immediately. Some looked confused, others irritated. A few even confronted me, asking what gave me the right to put up such signs. I didn't argue. I simply showed them the deed. Silence followed, usually with a muttered curse or a quick retreat. But the HOA wasn't silent for long. Within 2 days, I received an email from the board demanding I remove the signs. They claimed the lake was a shared amenity of the community and that I had no legal authority to restrict access. I replied with a single sentence. Ownership records are attached. The lake is no longer yours to regulate. Attached was a scanned copy of the deed. The fallout was immediate. The next HOA meeting turned chaotic, neighbors shouting over one another while the board scrambled for control. I didn't attend, but word traveled fast. The board had no answer. Their bluff had been called, their authority shattered. The very lake they had used as leverage over the community had slipped from their grasp and landed in the hands of the man they tried to humiliate. But I wasn't done yet. Owning the lake meant I could enforce the rules. And my first rule was simple. No HOA access. I posted a notice on the community bulletin board and emailed every resident. Effective immediately, the lake is private property. Fishing, boating, and swimming are prohibited without written permission from the owner. Any violations will be reported as trespassing. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of acceptance. It was the silence of shock. Families who had spent weekends at the shoreline, board members who had boasted of their lake, children who had played in the shallows, suddenly all of it was gone. The HOA had turned their weapon of control into my personal trophy, and there was nothing they could do. Of course, That didn't stop them from trying. Within a week, I received a certified letter threatening legal action. They claimed I had acted outside the bounds of community agreements. But the problem for them was simple. The deed didn't lie. The county records didn't lie. The law didn't lie. They could pound their fists on the table all they wanted, but their signatures weren't on the deed. Mine was. I framed the letter and hung it on the wall of my office, not as a warning, but as a reminder. A symbol of just how far arrogance had fallen. Word spread beyond the neighborhood. Friends, co-workers, and even strangers online heard about the man who had been fined for fishing and responded by buying the lake. Some laughed, some cheered, and many sent messages of support. The story struck a nerve because everyone has faced petty authority at some point. Everyone knows the frustration of rules made for control rather than reason. But for the HOA, it wasn't a story, it was a crisis. Their reputation as the enforcers of the neighborhood had collapsed. The very lake they had flaunted in brochures and newsletters was no longer theirs to showcase. And worse, every resident knew it happened because they pushed too far. The next time I walked by the lake, I carried my fishing rod. I set up in the same spot where I had first been fined, cast my line into the water, and sat back in my chair. No guards approached. No board members scribbled on clipboards. The only sound was the gentle splash of water and the distant hum of cicadas. I had reclaimed my peace and stolen theirs, and this was only the beginning. The lake signs had been up for less than a week when the HOA began plotting their counterattack. These were not people accustomed to losing control. For years, they had dictated everything: what color your shutters could be, how high your grass could grow, where you could park your car. The lake had always been their crown jewel, a symbol of authority they wielded without challenge. And now, it was gone. The board called an emergency meeting. They sent out notices to every resident, painting me as a villain who had stolen the lake from the community. They spoke in dramatic tones, warning that property values would plummet and that children would be deprived of a safe place to play. They blamed me for selfishly undermining community spirit. But what they didn't mention was the truth, that it had been their arrogance, their $600 fine, and their 911 stunt that had pushed me here. They didn't tell residents that they never owned the lake to begin with, only pretended they did. And they certainly didn't admit that their greed had cost them everything. Still, the smear campaign began. Flyers appeared in mailboxes with bold headlines: "Neighbor jeopardizes community." Anonymous emails circulated painting me as unstable and dangerous. At first, some neighbors believed it. A few even confronted me, demanding to know why I had taken the lake. I didn't argue. I simply pulled out a copy of the deed, handed it to them, and said, "Read." Every time, the result was the same. Their anger turned to confusion, then to silence. Facts are stubborn things, and no amount of HOA bluster could erase the ink on that paper. The board's frustration grew. They tried to fine me again, citing violations like unsightly signage for the private property notices I had posted. They even attempted to restrict my parking privileges, sending me notices that my truck was too large for community standards. But what they failed to realize was that I had been preparing for this. I dug back into the HOA's own bylaws, poring through the hundreds of pages of restrictions they loved to wield. The more I read, the clearer it became. Their rules weren't weapons against me. They were weapons I could turn against them. For example, the bylaws required every HOA board member to disclose conflicts of interest. Yet the president of the board ran a landscaping company, and conveniently, his company held the exclusive contract for maintaining neighborhood lawns. A violation. Another rule prohibited board members from using HOA funds for personal benefit. Yet the treasurer had approved reimbursement checks for gas and meals, logged under community business. Another violation. I compiled everything into a dossier. Scanned documents, financial ledgers, even photographs. Every rule they had used to bully others, they themselves had broken. They weren't guardians of the community. They were hypocrites, in suits, lining their pockets while pretending to enforce order. The next HOA meeting, I didn't stay home. I attended. When my name was called during the open forum, I stepped forward, calm and steady, holding the binder under my arm. The board members stiffened, clearly uncomfortable. They expected complaints, maybe anger. They weren't ready for facts. I laid the documents on the table one by one. Each violation I presented was met with gasps from residents. The room shifted as the truth spread. People who had once nodded obediently at the board now glared with suspicion. The smugness drained from the board members' faces. Finally, I spoke clearly. You fined me $600 for fishing. You called the police on me for sitting by a lake you didn't even own. And while you harassed me, you violated your own bylaws again and again. You claim to protect this community, but all you've protected is your control. Silence followed, then murmurs, then outright anger. But this time, not at me, at them. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to question the board suddenly found their voices. They demanded answers. They demanded resignations. The meeting, meant to rally support against me, collapsed into chaos that the board could not contain that night. I walked home past the lake, the private property signs glowing in the moonlight. The water was still, reflecting the stars. I felt a calm satisfaction settle over me. The HOA had tried to retaliate, but they had only exposed their own corruption. The lake was mine, the board was fractured, and the community had seen the truth. For years, the HOA had controlled the neighborhood with fear and fines. Now their empire was cracking, and I wasn't done pressing. The next phase wasn't about survival. It was about turning their downfall into something permanent. The fallout from the meeting spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. For years, residents had obeyed the HOA out of fear of fines, fear of confrontation, fear of being singled out. But now the curtain had been pulled back, and people could see the strings. The board members weren't enforcers of order. They were manipulators, hiding behind rules while breaking them whenever it suited their pockets. The president, once the loudest voice in the room, suddenly grew quiet. Neighbors whispered about his landscaping business, about how he had profited from mandatory contracts. The treasurer avoided eye contact when people asked about the reimbursement checks. One by one, their credibility cracked. Meanwhile, the lake stood as a symbol of their defeat. The private property signs gleamed in the sun, visible from the walking trails that circled the water. Families who had once brought picnics to the shore now hesitated at the edge, muttering about how quickly everything had changed. Children asked why they couldn't swim anymore. Parents shook their heads, some angry, others resigned. Every complaint traced back to the same truth. The HOA had overplayed their hand, and I had called their bluff. Some residents came to me quietly, asking for permission to fish or walk by. The water. I didn't grant it. Not yet. It wasn't about punishing them, but about making a point. For too long, they had accepted the HOA's arrogance. They needed to feel what it was like to live under rules they hadn't chosen. Only then would they understand the weight of what had been done to me. The HOA board scrambled. They sent out newsletters trying to spin the narrative, insisting they were working on solutions. But the more they wrote, the more desperate they sounded. No one believed them anymore. Attendance at their meetings dwindled. Residents stopped paying attention to their notices. The empire of fear that had ruled for so long was crumbling, brick by brick. But I wasn't satisfied with just watching them collapse. I wanted to make it permanent. I began reinforcing my claim to the lake, filing additional permits for environmental upkeep. I hired an independent contractor to perform water quality tests and submitted the reports to the county. Every action I took cemented my ownership, leaving no opening for the HOA to challenge me. The county supported it. They had been glad to see someone take responsibility for the lake. And the more official my ownership became, the weaker the HOA's arguments grew. Meanwhile, the board members turned on each other. I heard through neighbors that shouting matches erupted behind closed doors. The president accused the treasurer of incompetence. The secretary threatened to resign. Accusations of mismanagement and fraud flew across the table like daggers. The same group that had once united to fine me $600 couldn't even agree on how to keep their own positions intact. The turning point came when a group of residents formally petitioned to recall the board. The evidence I had presented, the conflicts of interest, the misuse of funds, was more than enough to rally signatures. The board that had once seemed untouchable now faced its own rules used against them. The very bylaws they had clung to were being weaponized by the people they had controlled. I didn't lead the petition. I didn't need to. The community had found its own strength now. But I watched closely, knowing that every step they took was another crack in the foundation the HOA had built on arrogance. And through it all, the lake remained mine. I fished when I pleased, sitting in the same spot where it all began. My line, cutting through the water with calm precision. Every cast was a reminder. They had tried to take something from me, but in the end, I had taken everything from them. At night, I walked the shoreline under the moonlight, listening to the stillness. It wasn't just a body of water anymore. It was a symbol of resistance, of victory, of a lesson carved deep into the neighborhood's memory. The HOA had thought they could bully me into submission. Instead, they had pushed me into ownership, into power they couldn't touch. But I wasn't naive. Desperate people make desperate moves. The HOA wasn't finished, not yet. And I knew their final act was coming. The question was, would they go quietly or would they ignite a fight they couldn't win? The HOA didn't go quietly. They never do. When petty power is all someone has, they cling to it until the last possible moment, even when everyone else can see it slipping through their fingers. Their final move came in the form of a lawsuit. A thick envelope arrived one morning, stuffed with legal papers accusing me of illegally seizing community property. They claimed the purchase of the lake was invalid, that the HOA had exclusive rights, and that I had caused irreparable harm to the neighborhood. I almost laughed as I flipped through the pages. They were throwing every argument they could, hoping something would stick. But it was weak. The law was on my side. The county was on my side. And most importantly, the facts were on my side. Still, I wasn't about to underestimate them. Desperation makes people reckless. I called my attorney, a sharp man who had dealt with HOAs before. He read through the paperwork and smirked. They're bluffing. They don't have a case. But instead of just defending myself, I went on offense. We filed a countersuit, citing harassment, defamation, and abuse of authority. We included every letter, every fine, every 911 call, and every violation of their own bylaws I had uncovered. We made it clear this wasn't just about fishing anymore. This was about years of intimidation and corruption. The court date arrived, and the room was packed with neighbors curious to see the showdown. The HOA board sat at one table, their lawyer shuffling papers nervously. I sat at the other, calm, my attorney confident. The judge listened patiently as the HOA tried to argue their case, but with every claim they made, we countered with documentation, deeds, and county records. When it was our turn, my attorney laid everything out in meticulous detail. He showed the financial irregularities, the conflicts of interest, the misuse of HOA funds. He revealed the truth about the lake, that it had never been theirs, that they had no legal right to regulate it, and that their fines and threats were built on lies. The judge didn't need long. The HOA's case was dismissed, and my countersuit was allowed to proceed. The board members sat pale and silent, their empire collapsing in front of everyone. News of the ruling spread like wildfire. Neighbors celebrated openly. Some even stopped by my house to shake my hand, thanking me for standing up when no one else dared. The board members resigned one by one, unable to withstand the shame. Within weeks, the HOA was dissolved entirely, its power broken beyond repair. And the lake, it remained mine, untouchable. I didn't turn it into a fortress. I didn't charge fees or sell memberships. Instead, I kept it simple. I allowed respectful neighbors access with written permission, but the rules were mine, not the HOA's. No clipboards, no fines, no arrogance. Just peace. One evening, as the sun set over the water, I sat in my old chair with a fishing rod in hand. The surface of the lake shimmered gold, the air still and calm. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt free. I thought back to the day it all began, when two smug board members handed me a $600 fine for fishing. They had wanted to humiliate me, to teach me a lesson. But in the end, I had taught them one instead. Power built on arrogance always collapses. Respect, once lost, is never regained. And now, the lake they once used as a weapon of control stood as a monument to their downfall, a quiet stretch of water that belonged to the man they tried to break. The HOA had called 911 on me for casting a line. Today, they no longer existed. And every time I cast my line into the water, I smiled at the memory of how it all started. $600 and a bluff that cost them everything. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit like, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story.